When we map entities to relations or tables, we need to consider mapping attributes. Now, attributes will differ in mapping based on the type of attributes. For simple attributes, we will map them directly to relations and they will serve as column names. In the case of composite attributes, we will use their simple parts, which are the components of the attribute. And as we said, a relational model cannot have multivalued attributes, so these will become a separate relation with a foreign key. So let's see an example on each one of those. Let's start with simple attributes, and the rule in here is to map directly. So if we have the customer entity type with all simple attributes, we will just map them directly as column names, as we can see in the figure below. Now, in the case of composite attributes, the rule says you use the symbol components of the attribute. So if we have this entity type, and then we have customer ID, customer name, and customer address, and finally postal code, as you can see, all of them are simple attributes except customer address, which is consisting of the street and city and the state. And the rule says we will use the components. So we will map this attribute as these three components because these are the three components that are in the address attribute. And for multi-valued attributes, the rule says we map them into a separate relation with a foreign key. Now the name of the table refers to the attribute's name. We will use the primary key of the entity itself as a foreign key. And usually all columns are a composite primary key for that relation. So we will look at the skill, for example, in this figure that we have in here. So we have the employee entity type, and then we have skill as a multi-valued attribute. So we will map employee ID, employee name, and employee address. And in this case, we consider that employee address as a simple attribute, and that is why it's mapped directly. But then for skill, we will create a new table or a new relation, and the name of that relation is going to relate to the attribute itself. And we will use employee ID and skill itself as a composite primary key, and employee ID is going to be a foreign key. Now this arrow here tells me that employee ID is a foreign key referring to employee ID in here. The reason I have a solid underline because the solid underline overrides the dashed underline, but then we have the arrow that tells me that this is a part of the primary key as well as a foreign key. Now for mapping weak entities, as we mentioned before, weak entities will rely on strong entities to exist. So we will map the strong entity first, and then we will map the weak entity. We will include the primary key of the strong entity with the attributes of the weak entity as a foreign key. And we will connect the foreign key to the primary key of the strong entity. So we have this example here where we have employee as the strong entity and dependent as the weak entity. So we will map both of them, and then we will have employee ID as a part of the primary key as well as being a foreign key. And this arrow right here shows me that this in fact is a foreign key referring to the primary key in the entity in the employee entity or employee relation.